Hello, I'm Togo Moyo, Associate Dean for Communications and Public Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School. I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but it's a very warm welcome to you wherever you are. It really is my immense pleasure to be hosting Session 8 of En route to COP26. And this session looks at how we can make the economics for transport decarbonization work during this global recession. We have a fantastic lineup for you, some very substantive discussions with really excellent speakers. Before we get into that, let's take a quick recap at the state of the climate crisis. Hello, welcome back. As I mentioned, my name is Togo Moyo. I'm really excited to be here. We have an excellent lineup of speakers, and I'm looking forward in particular to the practical insights and ideas for how we can continue to advance progress in reducing carbon dioxide emissions in the transport sector. The transport sector produces nearly 25% of the energy-related carbon dioxide that's causing climate change. And as we saw in the video, 5 years after the Paris Agreement on climate change, transport emissions are still rising. Now, as you know, because of the global pandemic, COP26 was not held in Glasgow as planned this year, and it's been rescheduled to next year. This event is part of an overall plan by the international transport community to keep the momentum going. Our goal for this session is to kick off a series of conversations over the next 12 months leading up to COP26, which will highlight conducive policy measures and good practice examples that are worth replicating. The session is organized by Sustainable Mobility for All, Some for All, with support from the Transport Decarbonization Alliance and the World Resources Institute. Together, we'll explore opportunities to scale up the investments required to accelerate transport decarbonization and dig into the persistent barriers that have prevented these investments occurring, knowing, of course, that the current context of global public health crisis, that the current context of the global public health crisis and the economic recession presents a unique set of opportunities and challenges that we need to overcome. So what's the format? Well, we have two panels. In the first panel, we'll examine what we're up against for scaling up investments in transport decarbonization and what the impact of the pandemic and the global recession are. Then in panel 2, we'll turn to practitioners who share their experiences on the ground about the progress that's being made in their countries or their cities during this time. We'll hear examples of key policies that have been adopted, the size and type of investments that are making a difference, and also a little bit about the obstacles they're facing and what they believe are critical factors for progress. I really do hope you can stay with us for the entire time. And as always, we want to keep the conversation going. So please use hashtag #EnRouteCOP26 and hashtag #SomeForAll. But before we get into the panels, we have 3 speakers who will help set the scene for why we're here today and give us a little bit of context. The first speaker is Makta Diop, who's the Vice President for Infrastructure at the World Bank. After that, we'll have remarks from the Minister of Transport of Ethiopia, Her Excellency Dagomit Bekele, and then we'll round off with Aruna Ote, who is the Executive in Residence at the Said Business School at Oxford University. Over to Makta Diop.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining this important session. Let me also thank our host, the Government of Netherlands and the Minister Stijn for the great initiative we are proud to support. Making the economics of transportation decarbonization work is crucial not only to COVID-19 recovery, but also to the outlook for sustainable transport and our future climate goals. A quarter of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions come from transport, which could grow to a third by 2050 if nothing is done. The good news is that decarbonizing transport makes sound economic sense. Solutions such as e-mobility have the potential to create quality jobs with several key sectors. Other promising areas include cleaner public transportation, systems such as BRTs and metros, shared mobility, and smart urban planning. At the same time, sustainable recovery gives policymakers a unique opportunity to tap into global recovery financing and push policy reforms such as car emission standard. Earlier this year, during the annual meeting of the World Bank, a group of policymakers, private sector leaders, met and reiterated their full commitment to accelerating the adoption of transport solutions that promote inclusive and sustainable growth. Our partnership is essential as it allows us to bring together our knowledge and to pool our financial resources. This is a condition to accelerate the transformation of the transport sector that is so much needed to meet our target in terms of emissions. Sustainable Mobility for All, that initiative, is an important initiative as it provides us an excellent framework to make transportation green, inclusive, and efficient. It gathers most of the people today working on the sector, and we are working hard to make it even stronger. We plan to coordinate all our efforts to make sure that COP26 is an opportunity to put on the map the discussion on transport and emissions in the transport sector. We are sure that all the practice and best practice that we will be sharing during this session will allow us to take our game to the next level and make sure that providing to countries solutions that are so much needed for greening transportation. Thank you very much, and best of luck for the rest of your work. Transportation. Thank you very much, and best of luck for the rest of your work.
Thank you very much there to Makta Diop, who is the Vice President for Infrastructure at the World Bank. And it's very helpful to hear how the World Bank is working with other partners to try and advance the agenda of transport decarbonization. And we'll certainly be looking a little more into what type of partnerships, collaboration, and coordination is necessary to make the type of critical success that we're after. That will be in our panels, but first, we're extremely honored now to have the Minister of Transport of Ethiopia, the Honorable Dagamit Boges Bekele, who give remarks which share some of the innovations and policies shaping the transport sector in Ethiopia. A very warm welcome to you, Madam Minister.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. Excellencies, distinguished participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to speak on this event, discussing how to make the economics for transport decarbonization work during this recession, with the emphasis what innovation and policies are shaping the transport sector in Ethiopia. As we all agree, emission from motor vehicles of different kinds could cause widespread impact on society at large and the environment. Numerous studies have suggested that exposure to air toxics can cause health and environment-related challenges. In countries like Ethiopia, although rate of car ownership is not more than 1.2 million for 100 million population, yet level of air pollution in cities like Addis Ababa, our capital, is rising from time to time. According to the National Meteorology Agency of Ethiopia, based on a study conducted a year ago, pollution rate of a city was around 65 microgram per meter cube, which was higher than the World Meteorological Organization's rate of 25 microgram per meter cube. According to the European Union EDGAR 2019 data, Ethiopia is accountable for 0.04% of the world's greenhouse gas emission and is 93rd in the ranking of nations contributing to global greenhouse gas emission. Taking the lengthy pollution levels of cities like Addis Ababa, as we are a developing nation, we choose not to sit and anticipate calamities of population-related catastrophes. We rather choose to mitigate and bring innovative and sustainable solutions to it. Ethiopia has been a leader on climate change in Africa and amongst developing nations across the world. Ethiopia is now more than committed to tackle climate challenge through transformative economic approach that focus on low carbon growth and green economy driven by sustainable mobility. One could simply observe this commitment by the actions that we have been implementing in recent years, starting from a recent more than 9 billion trees planting campaigns conducted in just 2 years, until the study and implementation of National Climate Resilient Green Economy Strategy document and transport sector's own Climate Resilient Green Economy Strategy document, all aimed to realize a more sustainable, resilient, and green Ethiopia. Ethiopia's Climate Resilient Green Economy Strategy has 3 complementary objectives. The first one is fostering economic development and growth. The second one is ensuring abatement and avoidance of future emission and improving resilience to climate change. The transport pillar of the National Climate Resilient Green Economy Strategy has also clearly stipulated the need to leapfrog to modern and energy efficient technologies in transport. The Climate Resilient Green Economy Strategy approach to the transport sector recognized the largest contributor to Ethiopia's transport sector emission was road transport, both passenger and freight vehicles. Using the National Climate Resilient Green Economy Strategy as a frame, the transport sector's Climate Resilient Green Economy Strategy was also formulated very recently in 2018, with the overall focus and objective and to support the creation of affordable, integrated, safe, responsive, and sustainable transport system that enhances the environment, economic, social, and cultural well-being of all Ethiopians. The strategy focused on the reduction exposure of human health, safety, environment to the negative impact of transport pollution and reducing the greenhouse gas emission from the country's transport network. Strengthening the transport sector resilience by improving overall system in planning and implementation and coordination, and making the sector more robust and adaptive in the face of climate risk and vulnerabilities has been the priority agenda and task of ministry and its accountable institutions. And this continued commitment has been reflected again while preparing our national transport policy, non-motorized transport strategy, and even our 10-year transport sector perspective development plan. Our national transport policy, which becomes operational a few months ago, has highlighted the transport sector's strong bind and considered towards safeguarding and protecting our natural environment. Some of this strategy formulation in the policy document include rehabilitation of forests affected during the construction of transport infrastructure, strengthening environmental impact assessment prior to the construction process that we start in any kind of transport infrastructure development, preparation of transport standards in compliance with the climate resilient green strategy contents, encouraging the provision of transport services operating in renewable energy sources, put in place a sub-policy to determine the maximum operating life of imported vehicles and support the private sector to engage in automotive industry to set up assembly units are some of what we did to mention. It is said in different literatures that 3 main strategies can help a certain country energy needs. These are optimization, electrifying, and decarbonization. Optimizing our energy use, which is shifting energy demand from fuel to electricity and gradually shifting entirely to zero carbon technologies, have all been started to be practiced in Ethiopia. Generally, the following could be taken as an example that we have applied so far in relation to those energy saving, optimizing, and decarbonization principles. The first one is the country has now 756 Addis Djibouti railway line and 34 kilometers light railway transport that fully operates using electricity. And also Ethiopia has started the implementation of its first national non-motorized transport strategy which paves the way to construct more pedestrian bikeways across the country. And in relation to this, we have a plan to construct nearly 300 kilometers pedestrian ways and 200 kilometers bicycle ways in Addis Ababa, in the capital alone. The Addis Ababa city government has started the construction of Ethiopia's first bus rapid transport corridor, which is intended to complete in just 2 years' time. And when it is completed, the BRT lane will be operational using only electric buses. And very recently, Ethiopia has started assembling electric vehicles through the private firm called Marathon Motors, which we also encourage others to come and invest in such investment endeavors too. We have started the formulation of Ethiopia's first automotive policy, which clearly favors green mobility. We have started a study on emission standards, and hopefully it will get completed in this year. We have a plan to introduce Ethiopia's first cable car transport system, and we also undertook a study proposal on levying green tax on vehicles, which could be a sound and sustainable source of finance and support actions, which can bring significant greenhouse gas emission reduction in cost-effective manner. Besides the policy formulation and implementation, in lieu with the climate resilient green economy strategy documents, we have now finalized 10-year perspective transport sector plan, which envisages to increase the transport infrastructure network of the country and advance the transport operation. Among the targets that we set out, increasing the total electrified railway line to 4,199 kilometers can be mentioned as one example. The other could be introduction of non-motorized transport system, such as walking and cycling to Ethiopian 69 urban centers, which has a population of 50,000 and above. We have envisaged to increase the rate of urban mass transit from its current 34% to that of 70%, which is expected to reduce the high influx of small vehicles in urban centers. In addition to the current ongoing BRT projects, Addis Ababa city will have more than 7 BRT lanes in the coming years. Increase in the capacity of Addis Ababa's light rail transport passenger from its current 75,000 to that of 200,000 per day could be mentioned as some of the targets that we set to attain this green climate resilient strategy in our country. Some developing states even do not have ability to tackle and to track their levels of emission and its lethal impact, which needs our action to come together to bring knowledge and information management platforms. Besides, we have scarcities related to skilled manpower, which needs rigorous skill and knowledge development regarding the decarbonization and onset of decarbonization. Developing states should also be encouraged to prioritize their transport strategies, focusing on streets to vehicle to that of streets for people, which could pave the way of constructing more bike lanes and pedestrian ways, which could boost a sustainable and green transport mechanism. During my presence at Transforming Transportation TTDC 20 in Washington, DC, we held discussion with Dr. Nancy, head of Sustainable Mobility for All, regarding the importance of measuring our sustainable mobility performance. We believe measuring our efforts to realize sustainable green mobility has critical importance as to whether we are on the right track or not, and to set and check the policies and strategies that we have are in place or not, so as to know whether our sustainable mobility paradigm answers basic tenets of safety and efficiency, and more importantly, as it helps us to realize our track of mobility in relation to sustainable development goals. Lastly, I would like to appreciate this effort that has been commenced as a pilot project in South Africa, as my country, Ethiopia, also has the need for database mobility decision, we also need onset of this global roadmap of action towards sustainable mobility at country level. I believe this could help the country make the right investment and policy choice evidenced by proper data. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Bekele. And what a really encouraging and very inspiring remarks. It's wonderful to hear the very practical actions that you're taking, as well as the policy, the very integrated policy that you've put in place for the green resilience climate strategy that you have in place. I think a lot of points that we'll want to come back to in our second panel when we speak to other practitioners about what's working during this time in their countries and cities. And I think there are a lot of lessons that we could draw from the process that you started and the road that you're taking to net zero. So thank you very much for that. The panels come up a little later, but for now, it's my extreme pleasure to introduce Arumna Ote, who is a seasoned development practitioner who was previously the Vice President of Treasury at the World Bank. Among her many accomplishments in that role was the successful drive for the evolution of the green bond market. She is currently an executive in residence at Said Business School at the University of Oxford, where her research focuses on capital markets, economic development, and financial technology. She's going to be sharing her thoughts about leveraging innovative finance for transport decarbonization. Arumna, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you so much, Toyo. I'm so delighted to be participating in this event. And I need to thank Dr. Nancy Van Dyke for her kind invitation and her colleague, Jennifer, who really made sure that I joined you today. I'm so delighted at the impressive work that Makta Diop, the VP of Infrastructure, and his team are leading. And of course, excited to reconnect with development practitioners. I do believe, as both the VP and the minister talked about, that transport decarbonization is such an important topic because mobility is such an important part of our lives. What I thought I would do is provide some context for how we can leverage innovative finance, then present some case studies for how you leverage innovation in traditional funding sources, and then finish with innovative finance from capital markets, starting with the green bond market. I'm trying to move my slides and I'm having difficulty moving my slides, but I'll carry on and go to the context. I'm not sure why my slides are, okay, thank you. My slides are now moving. Very important. The needs are huge, and I think the VP talked about it, but let me just put some numbers that comes out of the Global Infrastructure Hub that's also hosted by the World Bank. We need around $93 trillion of investments by 2040. Of this total in infrastructure, the transport sector alone requires $50 trillion, and the gap is $10 trillion. The good news, though, is that the investors are very excited about this sector. First, there's a lot of interest in sustainable investing. For example, global flows in terms of environment, social, and governance-driven assets have tripled to $40.5 trillion this year, according to the Pension and Investment Journal. Investors want to do good and do well. We have a low yield environment that is probably expected to continue over the next few years. Deutsche Bank estimates that 25% of the global debt outstanding is earning negative yields. Last month, Bloomberg reported that it was $600 billion. Infrastructure assets are attractive in a low interest environment because the cash flows are predictable and because, of course, returns are reasonable and consistent. Those who've spoken before me talked about the supportive environment. I will just add that I'm so proud of what the young people are doing in making us understand the importance of focusing on climate issues. I give more specifics on the huge funding needs. For me, scaling up has to happen at every level, with government resources, with quasi-government resources, and I focus on development banks more specifically. And we need to make sure that we're tapping into the private sector for various reasons. There's a lot of funds that wants to do good, but that's how you connect with society. Let me talk about leveraging development banks as an example. And I'm going to use a variety of case studies to make my point. Most multilateral development banks, one of the instruments that they use a lot is project loans. One of my favorite projects that we often talk to investors about when we marketed the green bonds, the World Bank green bonds, when I worked at the World Bank, was the rapid bus system project in Colombia. The World Bank gave its first loan to it in 2004 for $250 million. And by the end of the project had provided $1.1 billion. Some of the benefits don't just come from the money. They come from the role that development banks play, which is to help with knowledge and technical assistance. So this is a project where sulfur dioxide will decline by 43%. Fuel savings will be over 1 million tons of oil that will be saved. Similarly, syndication amongst multilateral agencies. I show an example of a project in Ecuador, the Quito Metro Line project, which basically was building of 23 kilometers of metro rail and 15 stations. 4 development banks were involved. They were able to complement the resources of Ecuador to provide for $1.7 billion. But for me, what is significant is that the involvement of development banks means that there is greater emphasis on sustainability. Next, public-private partnership. I talk about scaling. We need huge resources. So being able to bring public sector financing and private sector financing is absolutely important. I present 2 projects that I like here. The Colombia 4th Generation Road Concession Program. Phenomenal project. The value is estimated at $14 billion. In addition to the development banks coming in, the IFC put together a framework that has helped domestic banks participate, helped international banks participate. And therefore, you can literally raise $14 billion of value that can transform the network of roads in Colombia. The Turkey Health Transformation Program. I love showcasing this project because it's fascinating, because it's probably the largest PPP that you'll have in the health sector. Its estimated value is 20 billion euros. EBRD contributing 800 million euros, including a guarantee for a green bond for one of the projects. IFC providing $240 million of its own money, mobilizing another $540 million. World Bank doing what it does well, provide technical assistance, provide loans. In addition, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, one of the members of the World Bank Group, provides political risk mitigation on 6 projects to the tune of $855 million. So PPPs important. PPPs important. Let me take the next example. The next example I'd like to showcase is IFC's managed co-lending portfolio program, something that IFC introduced very recently to enable global investors be able to participate in the kinds of projects that IFC invests in when it invests in the private sector in emerging markets. This particular platform they put together, it was made possible because they agreed to provide a first loss guarantee to global investors so that they can feel comfortable investing in this platform and make the same kinds of the returns that they normally make. That guarantee, that first loss they're able to provide because of a partnership with the Swedish International Development Corporation. And they were able to attract the creme de la creme of investors, $7.1 billion. So the People's Bank of China, their reserve management arm, put in $3 billion over a 6-year period. The largest insurance companies and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. So another opportunity to focus on how we can do more of what we're already doing. Another area that I want to focus on is a trend that we're seeing is that we're seeing a lot more emphasis on national development banks and regional development banks. I think there's an understanding that they provide patient capital, they provide medium to long-term funding, they provide knowledge and technical assistance. So of course, you have the Africa Finance Corporation, which was founded 13 years ago with 27 shareholders that's doing today about $7.2 billion. You've got the BRICS Bank that was founded 5 years ago. All of you are familiar with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which today has 103 shareholders. Canada Infrastructure Bank was announced, started business in 2017, and only last week, the Chancellor of the Exchequer here in the UK announced that Britain will establish the British Infrastructure Bank. So there is a recognition as to the important roles that these institutions play, and particularly in respect of infrastructure. Now let me turn to innovative finance and starting with green bonds. The green bond market, fascinating market. As many of you know, a green bond is a bond that is associated with assets where the underlying where the underlying assets are green in nature. And they're guided by the green bond principles, which are hosted by the International Capital Markets Association. The use of proceeds are monitored. There's impact reporting to investors. This green bond market has, of course, birthed other markets. There is now a gender bond market, there's a blue bond market, there's sustainability bond market, and there's a social bond market, all of which are opportunities for you to target investors who may be interested in specific types of areas. This was a market which was basically founded 12 years ago, where the World Bank did the first green bond for only about $290 million in response to Nordic investors, their pension funds, saying, we want to be able to invest and manage and understand the risks that we're facing. Today, the market has an annual issuance of more than $260 billion. Last year was $263 billion, and this year it will probably be more. 20% of the proceeds of green bonds go to the transport sector. And between environmental, social, and sustainability bonds, you have outstanding $1.2 trillion. So that is another opportunity. Let me focus on an area where hopefully it will challenge those who support the Sustainable Mobility for All initiative to think creatively about setting up a similar organization. So the World Bank is also the treasurer of the International Financing Facility for Immunization. I was a pioneer board member in 2006, but the UK government and the French government came together and said, we want to be able to have funding available today for providing vaccines to the poorest nations in the world. So a structure was designed where pledges that are made over a 25-year period by governments, in this case, Australia, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, South Africa, Spain, Sweden, and the UK. On the back of those pledges that are made over 25 years, funds have been raised today. And to date, the International Financing Facility for Immunization has raised $5.7 billion that has helped the Global Alliance for Vaccine and Immunization be able to immunize more than $820 million and, of course, save lives. This structure can be replicated for transport decarbonization. Another structure that I'd like to showcase is Garanco. The reason I showcase Garanco is that one of the issues that you manage in infrastructure is issues around currency. So what Garanco does is actually provide local currency guarantee solutions for infrastructure development. It's done about 49 guarantees totaling $1.1 billion and has been able to mobilize an additional $4.7 billion from the private sector. And 10%, 10.6% of their current portfolio is transport projects. So yet another opportunity, including to manage the currency risks that entities face. There are many other examples. I list disaster risk management bonds because this is a really important area, because it helps you manage risk related to natural disaster. And the infrastructure sector, the transport sector, of course, has to deal with issues of resilience. There are asset recycling initiatives, there are infrastructure funds, there are listed infrastructure securities. The private equity industry and the private debt industry has done a lot of work associated with finance, with innovative finance for infrastructure. Islamic finance, it's asset-based, it's ethical, so it lends itself to sustainable transport. And in fact, there is today green Islamic finance that's doing also very well. What we're also seeing is that multilateral agencies are looking that we're purely funded by donor funds, are looking for ways to diversify into the to diversify their funding sources, including into the capital markets. And of course, I was delighted that the International Development Association, when I was at the World Bank Group and as treasurer of IDA, took the lead and brought and went to the capital markets, and today uses funds from the capital markets and funds from donors to be able to carry out its activities. Let me close by reiterating that I do believe that innovative finance can help bring the scale that we need to funding for decarbonizing the transport sector. I talked about the fact that the strength of the appetite that we see in the investor community. I talk about the supportive environment. There are innovations that can be done in the traditional funding areas, but there's also innovation in the capital market. I haven't spent time, in the interest of time, on some of the innovation that you can see in the banking sector, where people are looking at not just credit limits, but they're looking at carbon limits. Sustainability is phenomenal. The World Bank has a lot of data, but one of it is, of course, that the low carbon economy will certainly enable gains of $26 trillion in 10 years' time. And the minister talked about issues about job creation. And I do think that sustainable transport is so key to achieving the SDGs. But I really want to end with another illustration of what an enormous opportunity that sustainability and sustainable transport offers. Many of you are familiar with Tesla. The electric vehicle company, clean company. I don't have shares in Tesla, so I'm not marketing Tesla to anyone. But Tesla was founded 17 years ago in 2003. It then got listed on the NASDAQ in New York in 2010, 10 years ago, at $17 per share. By the way, its shares went down to $5. Today, the shares are trading at $584.76. That's a $554 billion market cap. And by the way, that's 8.67 times the market value of General Motors. I gave this example to say that is what the opportunity for sustainable transport represents. There will be risks along the way that need to be managed, but the opportunity is in sustainability, and the opportunity is in decarbonizing transport, and innovative finance is available to help. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Arumna. This was a really, really exciting, and I think the emphasis on the opportunity that's there for us to scale up funding, I think is a very real one. I think the hard reality of the financing gap that we have, I think some of the numbers that you gave us, 93 trillion needed by 2040, but also coupled with the fact that you have investors that are wanting to do well and to do good. So that's an opportunity there in itself. Really appreciated you bringing in the various people that need to be involved, that scaling up will require all levels, government, tapping into the private sector. I'm excited in the next panel, we actually have someone from a multi-development bank from the Islamic Bank, and we can talk a little bit more about the role of multi-development institutions, development banks rather, not just for funding, but also their role in providing technical assistance and knowledge. So very, very rich, very practical, really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And I think we'll have an opportunity to to dig a little further and deeper into some of the ideas that you've put on the table in the panels that are going to follow. So again, very much, we're so pleased that you were able to join us. We do have a panel coming up next where we'll be taking a closer look and digging deeper, as I say, into some of the issues that we've heard from our speakers today around scaling up solutions for decarbonization of transport. We'll look at some of the perennial constraints that we have faced for a long time that slow down progress, and then also ask how the COVID pandemic and this recession that we're in is changing the way we approach or think about transport decarbonization. I have a really great panel to help with that, but first let's take a look at this video from TED Countdown. So we're ready now for our first panel where we want to talk about what some of the obstacles and opportunities for scaling up of solutions that we know could work for decarbonization of transport. And I want to look at both dimensions. So we know that there are some obstacles and some challenges that have been with us that are perennial and that have prevented us from taking the investments and that we know could work. But we also want to look at what the impact of the pandemic and the economic recession have been. We've had some really fantastic speakers, as I mentioned just before we went into the video, that have put on the table some ideas around how we can think innovatively and creatively about the financing gap and how we actually get to a point where we're able to finance these solutions. So the panel the panelists in this first panel are experts and have a lot to bring to the table. We have Tracy Crow, who's the Chief of Staff at Sustainable Energy for All, C4All. Tracy's background includes advising senior officials on clean energy policy and technology corporation opportunities. She's also spearheaded clean energy related campaigns and initiatives. We're also joined by Ahmed Al-Kobani, who's the Manager, Climate Change Division, Resilience and Social Development at the Islamic Development Bank Group. And his division is responsible for maintaining climate action in the Islamic Development Bank operation. And this includes increasing financing of green projects and climate adaptation investments, in addition to capacity building. And we heard a lot about capacity building and knowledge in Aruma's presentation within Islamic Development Bank. We also have Dr. Michael Travel of Aramco, an energy and chemical company. He leads up the commercial transport research activities focused on fuel and engine co-optimization and collaboration engagement with the commercial vehicle industry. He also chairs the transport work stream within the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is a voluntary CEO-led oil and gas industry initiative to catalyze meaningful actions on climate change. Thank you all for joining. So I think let's get right into it. We have a sector that we've heard has a lot of opportunities, but at the same time, there have been perennial obstacles that have prevented us doing the things that we want to do. We also have this added thing of the global recession and the pandemic. So maybe let me start with you, Ahmed. What's the impact of the pandemic and the recession on, how has it changed things for you in the Islamic Development Bank?
Thank you, Toko, and thank you to Nancy and the Sum4All for the invitation today. Happy to be speaking, and I'm really happy to be speaking actually after Aruma and the good points she highlighted on the role of MDBs. So it's been an interesting year, to say the least. And contrary to the belief that, of course, a lot of our attention has been going on fighting the pandemic, which is natural, especially the first few months, surprisingly, it actually increased the emphasis on the need for a green recovery, or as we call it, the building back better. You will find that all multilateral development banks, development organizations, including the Islamic Development Bank, have committed to a green recovery and committed to focusing on green investments and enabling or empowering our member countries or developing countries to go into the low carbon and resilient development pathways to avoid a crisis as what happened, as we've seen in the pandemic, being an irreversible crisis if it happens, due to climate change, that is. Another thing is that because of this, it's been quite clear that there's a scarcity of resources now. Countries are now going through it's not just a health crisis, it's an economic crisis, as you rightly said. So now people know that we cannot afford to be supporting what may not be considered as low carbon pathways or low carbon projects. So the attention of all multilateral development banks is now focusing on how can we optimize the resources and actually support this green growth and green economic recovery. So this is just a reflection of the initial outtakes, the initial outcomes of this pandemic.
That's terrific. That's a great way to start. Michael, let me ask you the same question. So when we look at the current context, what are we up against?
Yeah, it's a very interesting year for certain. What you saw in the first half of the year was a dramatic drop in emissions across the transport sector. And one of the challenges we have is that it also had a tremendous impact on revenues across the board for many businesses operating in that transport sector. You know, not just the oil and gas industry, but also the aviation industry, the shipping industry, the trucking industry. And what we're seeing this year is simply a refocusing on the economic viability of certain technical solutions. There's certainly an interest in low carbon fuels, in hydrogen and other solutions that can be used to decarbonize, but there's a renewed focus on making sure that those solutions are really economically viable, that a business can adopt them and be able to use them and still maintain their business situation and generate their revenues. So I'd say that's been a shift that we've seen certainly within the R&D organizations, that there's a very much an emphasis on that element, where before there might have been a bit more flexibility to consider some of these things outside of that.
Michael, we'll come back to that, because I think what you're starting to lead us to think about is this idea of companies having to make tough choices during this time. And so I'd like to hear a little bit more about how they're making those choices, particularly given things like the low energy price that we're currently facing. So we'll come back to that. Let me just bring Tracy in now. Tracy from Sustainable Energy for All. So could you, looking as well at the current context, reflect on the experience of C for All, on the importance of partnerships? We haven't brought that in the drive towards decarbonization.
Sure, thank you for having me as part of the panel. So very happy to be here. Sustainable Energy for All is all about partnerships, and we really recognize that it's only through strong and productive partnerships that are focused on action and implementation that will really get us to the net zero emissions by 2050. Looking specifically at transportation, it's said that all transportation solutions are local, and that may be true when they're implemented, but the ideas, the technologies, the business models, the solutions that are developed, that really are global, they're multidimensional, and are dependent on a wide range of partners. It's partners in terms of the cities and the local authorities, the states and regional authorities that may or may not fund, for example, mass transit. You've got national governments in setting efficiency standards, private sector innovation, ingenuity that's manufacturing the vehicles, the electric vehicles, mass transit, the battery technology, and so forth. It's government-funded research that developed the battery technology, that put the research efforts into increasing efficiency, that's brought down the cost to enable the private sector to really turn it into viable and implementable solutions. The international community, the multilateral development banks, finance institutions, of course, as we've just heard, are desperately needed to really support big infrastructure projects, clean transport, enable the investment into the renewable energy and the sustainable transport together through new business models. There's some really good examples, I think, out there about partnerships. One of them I just wanted to highlight that I thought was really interesting in how you look at partnerships. Shift Asia is a project that's been piloted in Thailand. It's expected to scale up to other countries, but it's approaching transport as a service. And this involves using surplus renewable energy during the day for smart charging stations and swapping stations for e-bike batteries. And this service has been promoted and used mostly by delivery drivers. So it's bringing in the governments, it's bringing in utilities, it's bringing in the private sector, commercial enterprises, small businesses, and civil society all coming together to really make something work for the society and that particular society and how it works. So I think we really have to look at new partnerships, new alliances that we really may not have thought about before. This is industry, it's real estate, it's cities, it's finance institutions that really can get outside of our siloed thinking and think about transport and energy together, and how do we really bring those together for an innovative approach that we may not have thought about before.
Ahmed, do you want to comment on that? As you work with the Islamic Development Bank, what role is partnerships playing when we think about this huge financing gap and the need to be creative? Can you give us a sense of how that's playing out for you in this current context and what that means?
Thank you, Dr. That's actually a key point, because this also highlights the role of multilateral development banks. We've seen in the presentation before this, the financing gap in infrastructure is massive, and transport specifically, and infrastructure, generally speaking. And one of the key things that we've been trying to do as multilateral development banks is actually be drivers for change. So what we want to do is try to bring out new tools, new innovative financing tools. We've heard about the green bonds. The Islamic Development Bank, for example, issued our first Islamic green sukuk, which is the Islamic mode of green bonds of 1 billion euros last year. We want to have more of those issuances. We're thinking more and more of de-risking facilities in order to encourage the private sector to go into those new areas and new technologies. And one of the things here is that on some occasions, on many occasions, these technologies are proven technologies. So that, for example, they might be more accessible and more affordable for developed countries, and they're actually widely tested. But it is our role to make them more available to those developing countries that might not be at that level. And this is where we focus our financing. What we're thinking of is how to bring in transformative finance, especially on the climate front and in a key sector like transport. So in terms of mitigation finance, to give you an example, last year, the multilateral development banks financed 76%. Unfortunately, we want to increase our adaptation finance. 76% out of $62 billion on climate in 2019 was on mitigation. And out of that, the largest share, 29%, was actually focused on transport. Now, the issue is not the amount in terms of $1 billion. That's roughly $14 billion. But the idea here is how can we encourage private sector and other players to come in, and how do we leverage this financing to bring more and more change in the sector? Another thing in terms of partnership that I also wanted to flag very quickly is the role we want to play in capacity building and driving policies with these governments. So in addition to the finance we bring, this is why we work with Sustainable Energy for All, Sustainable Mobility for All, and this is why they have a key role to play with us, that we bring this financing, but we also bring this policy support. Where do we find the bottlenecks in different countries that prevent this shift to low carbon transport and low carbon development? And this is one of the key things that we try to emphasize in our engagement in the countries where we operate.
Ahmed, do you want to just unpack that a little bit? Because the reality is that we've had these bottlenecks and obstacles before, and there's always been that opportunity, but we haven't got to where we want to get to in terms of investments and actually executing and implementing those solutions. What's different now? What as you build on, as you talk about this green recovery, what's going to be the difference between what we saw in the past that prevented us getting to where we want to get to? I mean, what has changed now? What makes you so optimistic? Let me put it that way.
Well, we have to be, because we have no other choice. But let me tell you now, the momentum is much larger. As much as this year has been quite stressful, and economically we've seen, and we haven't seen the end of it, obviously, unfortunately, but we also recognize now that we need to move faster on the climate front. We've seen the momentum on every front. And one of the things that we also wanted to flag is that now all multilateral development banks and other development institutions, by the way, have committed to what we call Paris alignment. And by this Paris alignment, we're not just talking about our climate finance, but we're talking about all of our financing, all of our interventions should be in line with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So say we spend $1 billion in country X in a given year, we want to make sure that in all other sectors, including transport, we're not spending another $1 billion or $500 million that actually discredit or counter, the effect or the impact of the $1 billion of climate finance. We want to make sure now that all of our operations are in line with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And in order to do so, we have to work with governments and we have to work with them. And this is why one of the key priorities that we've flagged as multilateral development banks in this Paris alignment framework is actually more engagement with the governments and countries where we operate. We want to help them develop their low carbon development pathways. And as you can imagine, one of the key sectors for these pathways, low carbon and resilient development pathways to be developed, is through the transport sector, which means that now it's not really an option anymore for us to go to a country and say, oh, you want to finance one project or two projects, we're going to finance this is climate finance, great, check. That's not going to be the approach. So as I said, we're targeting more and more transformative finance, and hopefully by this engagement, helping countries develop their own low carbon development pathways in the transport sector. This paves the way for more private finance to come. Once the plan is ready, it's consistent, we identify where the financing gaps are, where the bottlenecks really are in this sector. We complement where there is high risk. We have de-risking facilities, we're innovative finance, we issue our green bonds, green sukuk, in order to mobilize the private sector. And hopefully, once we, let's say, go through this first bottleneck, this first step, we hope that, and this is what we've seen, we hope that the private sector comes in where the bulk of financing really is, and comes and complements this, where the countries are really on the right track, on the right way for this low carbon finance. And transport is one of the key sectors, I have to say, where without it, none of that can actually happen.
And I want to get back to Michael, but I just want to, just because you've mentioned the sort of engagement with the countries, let me just ask you another question around that. What's your experience been in getting countries to focus on sort of green development, given the very pressing priorities they have coming out of or being in the middle of this public health crisis and the impact that it's having on their development and just the economy in general? How do you get them to focus on that? And is there no tension between those two objectives?
It's a very valid question, actually. It's quite interesting because we've just heard the presentation from Her Excellency the Minister in Ethiopia, that she flagged and she spoke about their green and resilient development plan. And we've seen actually both ends. We've seen countries that were really focused on the immediate recovery, but at the same time now, a lot of governments, a lot of the countries we've been speaking to have actually been working on developing their own low carbon development plan in their development context. So they acknowledge that, yes, they do need immediate support, they do need immediate help, but as mentioned in all the sessions before, we need infrastructure for this economic recovery. We need infrastructure for this to build back and to get this green growth. And moreover, we need green jobs. We need to create green jobs. And this is where we want to shift the narrative, and this is where the dialogue is going. You'd be surprised the number of countries that are working on developing their low carbon development pathways right now, as I said, within the context of their development. And this is actually the advantage of these plans. And this is the advantage of when we talk about decarbonization pathways, because each country can develop its own in line with the 1.5 or 2 degree scenario, the Paris Agreement, and actually get to where they want in the way that suits them and suits their development context. So although it is not an easy decision when it's the time of crisis, but when we're talking about the recovery, you'd be surprised at the countries and how they've been receptive and how they actually seek more help to help them develop low carbon development plans.
I want to come back to you and this idea of a tension between wanting to continue with this agenda of getting to a point of net zero transport emissions, getting cleaner fuels, and just the reality that a lot of companies are facing right now, the impact it's had on their bottom line. Talk to us a little bit more about that. What are you seeing and what are some of the ways out of this? And throw in the idea of the low energy prices we see it now. What impact is that having?
Yeah, certainly. You're seeing an awful lot of focus on identifying the right fuel for the right sector at the right price. And this, I think, speaks to the complication and complexity of the overall challenge. Ideally, what you'd want to do is take a look at the system and identify the lowest cost technical solutions for the overall transport sector as a whole. But that may not be compatible with each of these sectors. And so as these businesses are looking at various options, they're trying to work through all the techno-economics and resolve this and say, okay, if we invest this much capital into purchasing a ship or an aircraft or a truck, and we anticipate that this particular solution will be available, can we make that work? Can our business owners that are buying these vehicles actually make their business profitable and be sustainable? So there's this tension between making sure that they can make money, but also reduce carbon. And I think there's also a bigger issue, which is that you get into competition between the different sectors. And ideally, what you'd like to do is find some commonalities, collaborative areas where you can start to look at each of these sectors, not independently, but together. For instance, what we're seeing in the passenger transport area is a very heavy focus on electrification. And electrification has a lot of advantages in that area. And there's a lot of flexibility for the owners of vehicles to choose to do that and to make that happen. As you move into the heavy truck space, electrification is much more difficult. And so in heavy trucking, they're looking at the possibility, maybe we can use hydrogen. And hydrogen can be a very good solution for long haul trucks, and it can be very effective. Now, if you move into marine shipping and long deep sea voyages, there's a strong consideration for ammonia as a fuel in this area. And ammonia comes along with its own infrastructural challenges and handling requirements and needs. And then you get to aviation. And aviation is saying, well, we can't use anything but a liquid fuel. So they're looking at biomass and synthetic fuels primarily as their paths to sustainable aviation fuels. And if you look at that and you say, okay, as a whole, this system is going to require a lot of individual investments in infrastructure for each of these different sectors. And I don't know if there's a viable path going through that right now. So you've got to find a way to resolve some of these business tensions where they're looking for economically viable solutions, but also consider the system as a whole and figure out how we're going to actually make the investments most effective.
And at the moment, we're seeing increases in sort of financing available because of the fiscal stimulus packages that have been on the table. Is this one way to overcome some of these barriers that you're talking about? So for example, you mentioned struggling with upfront costs in emissions of freight transport. Is that an opportunity? What are some of the things that you were thinking about that could help keep the momentum going?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can look at that passenger transport sector as a good example. A lot of the incentives that were put in place were done to reduce the price of an electric vehicle. And that was quite effective in really launching the critical mass needed to accelerate that market and reach a point where in the next 5 years or so, you're anticipating that the cost of an electric vehicle is going to hit parity with an internal combustion engine vehicle. The question comes down to, is that repeatable and can that be applied and copied to the commercial transport sector, where there may be a little bit less flexibility to choose a more costly solution, if you will, simply because of the business pressures that are being demanded of those operators. And maybe there's also a cautionary tale coming out of the United States. About 10 years ago, natural gas was assumed to be a solution for the heavy road trucking market. And it was expected that by 2020, something like 30 or 40% of trucks would be operating on natural gas. But that didn't happen. And there are many reasons for that. But one of the contributors was at the individual owner level. They were needing to lease these vehicles, and the leasing companies needed to figure out what the resale value of a natural gas truck would be. Well, there was no secondary market, so they automatically reduced the value down to next to nothing. And you can imagine what that would do to the lease rates. So yes, economically, natural gas had a significant price differential advantage over diesel, but when you got down to the nuts and bolts of the transaction and an owner operator, they were still not seeing the business solution that they needed to, simply because of unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very helpful to hear you explain it in that way. Just one more question. What are the sorts of things that you're hearing, for example, from the aviation sector? And I want to push again on this idea of we're in a time of low energy prices. Are you hearing requests that, as you do your research into efficient fuels, that you have a cost parity? I mean, is that something that is being pushed by private sector? Is that feasible? I'm curious to hear some of the conversations or discussions that you're having, just given where we are and how that's making the private sector think.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a discussion point that's been raised. And during some of our engagements, trying to understand what the path forward might look like, we've heard that some of the technical solutions being proposed, they're more or less accepted. They think that there's a path technically to apply some of these fuels. And the question becomes, can the price of a synthetic fuel or a biofuel be reduced to parity to a petroleum fuel? Well, that's a very good question. And obviously the oil and gas industry is looking into that and trying to understand, you know, how can we create low carbon fuels that are going to be introducible into these markets and accepted at a point where they can be adopted at a large scale. But yeah, it's a very challenging question to resolve. And we're trying to figure out even just, are some of these solutions scalable? If you take biomass, for instance, both the marine sector and the aviation sector are looking at this and saying, yes, we'd like to use biomass for our solutions, but is there sufficient biomass and can it be economically recoverable such that those sectors both can be taking advantage of it? That's an unknown question for us at this point, but certainly we're trying to resolve that and see, you know, are there pathways to get these fuels down to a point where they can be accepted by these businesses?
Tracy, I want to come back to you and just maybe as I think about your work on the sort of energy transport nexus, and I know you've been doing research and you published a report recently that focuses on this. What two messages would you say are still relevant in this COVID-19 context that we find ourselves in?
So the first, I think, is simply that this nexus between energy and mobility has never been more relevant. I mean, we're hearing today again about fossil fuel-based transport and the contribution to climate change and the contribution to poor air quality in cities around the world. So this is, you know, from what I would call outdated transportation, inefficient cars, trucks, buses, polluting vehicles, 2- and 3-wheelers, et cetera. And yeah, we're seeing the power sector making some impressive strides towards decarbonization. Still a long way to go, but really making some strides. And in the transport sector, not nearly as much. And there's still a long way to go to make inroads there. I think it's a little over 3% of transport currently is renewable energy powered. So this makes it the energy use sector with the least progress of decarbonization. And at the same time, you've got transport policymakers around the world who are struggling to provide the right infrastructure, and then also coping with these negative effects of the air quality. One thing I would note too is that it's the health impact associated with this air quality that also makes people more susceptible and vulnerable to things like COVID-19. So there's that linkage as well. We've talked about governments and the recovery packages that they're putting in place, and it really should be an opportunity to really jumpstart economies. And we're seeing some really good things. We heard from Ethiopia. There's really good things happening in Nigeria, their economic recovery package of ending fossil fuel subsidies. So there's really good opportunity to take advantage of this and put like savings from fossil fuel subsidy reductions or ending those subsidies towards renewable energy, and towards renewable energy that creates 3 times more jobs than the fossil fuel industry. So there's a lot of opportunity there to take advantage of. But the second message, I think, is that it's really looking that transport does affect quality of life. And having access to sustainable mobility really is important to achieve lots of the other sustainable development goals. And we talk a lot at Sustainable Energy for All about the millions of people who don't have access to electricity. But there's also the people that don't have access to transportation, to sustainable, accessible transportation, affordable transportation. So, one of the main messages out of the report that you mentioned, the Switching Gears report that we put out earlier this year, is that sustainable energy, low carbon mobility have to be developed together, and we really have to be thinking about those in a very holistic, integrated way. And when we were talking about partnerships before, if you're really thinking about this in an integrated way, then you really do have to think about all the different entities, partners that need to get brought into this, that's across energy and transport and land use, finance, and so forth. So really, thinking about transport as an access issue is something that I would just leave and say we will always want to keep the focus as well on access.
Thank you. Ahmed, let me come back to you and get your reactions on what you heard from the Minister Bekele from Ethiopia. They are being very proactive in their strategy for green development and resilience. And she talked about the transport policy that they have, their ambitions to move to non-motorized transport. What are some of the highlights that you heard, and how do they compare to your experience in other countries that you're working? What are some of the things that you heard were particularly interesting and that you might want to expand on?
Thank you. It's actually a good example of some of the things that we've been hearing. But it also touches on, and I'm sure even if it wasn't explicitly mentioned on what Tracy was just mentioning here about this comprehensive and systemic approach, this holistic approach. We cannot, and this is why you see more and more discussions on the energy transport nexus and how they're affected, and you cannot just focus on the on the transport sector alone and talk about e-mobility, for example, without looking at the energy sector and how it's going to cater for that and the increase in demand. And this is the good thing we've been seeing in some of the countries we've been talking with as well. When we talk about those low carbon development pathways, and when we talk about those long-term plans, fortunately, they're not just transport, and they're coming out of this silo thinking, and which makes our life easier. It is part of our role as multilateral development banks to be engaged in all sectors, as you can imagine, transport, energy, health, education, and so on and so forth. And I remember only very few years back where we always had the problem of making people sit and talk to each other, different stakeholders. Mm-hmm. And now we've been seeing that the ministries of environment, that we're talking about climate change and air pollution, are more and more engaged with the ministries of transport, the ministries of energy. And you can see when a minister comes and talks about a transport plan, that she'll make reference to energy, she'll make reference to the health. And this is exactly the type of thinking we're encouraging. Now, also one of the things that this makes our investments more consistent, because we want to enable more programmatic approach to finance. And this is how actually we encourage the private sector to come in, rather than just financing one project. And as you've heard from the minister, they have a long-term plan. So you would expect the investments requested to be consistent in that direction and to build on different elements that they need. And one of the things that were also mentioned by Tracy is addressing the policy issues, policy gaps. So one of the things we've seen in many of our countries are those fuel subsidies, obviously for fossil fuels, for vehicles. And these fossil fuel subsidies, energy subsidies, while they were meant to help, for example, help a large part of people that wouldn't afford those fuels for their vehicles. But now we find that these are not sustainable. They're not helping, and if we want to help more private sector as Michael was mentioning, for it to be more commercially feasible, for example, electrification, electric vehicles infrastructure, we have to remove these subsidies. And some of the things that you'd never hear countries speak of are being spoken of openly right now. Even oil-producing countries, I have to say, are more and more moving towards electric mobility, diversification, more renewable energy production, and linking both sectors, the renewable energy production to their transport sector and to their mobility sector. And one key thing is also, and to flag and to focus on that, there's a lot that could be done with available technologies, because I have to reiterate now, as Michael is mentioning, there's a lot of sectors where breakthroughs are still needed and research is still needed. However, there are others where the available technologies could be commercially feasible if we apply the right policies and the right measures in a lot of developing countries. So this is what we're trying to work on now, and hoping for more breakthroughs in these sectors that require the prices to go down, as we've seen for renewable energy, for example, and solar energy production, for example.
Okay, and I've just got a signal saying that we're actually at time, so I have to wrap up this this panel. But I don't want to end abruptly. I'll do a quick lightning round just to ask each of you if there's one big idea that you have that will really be significantly important, or a condition that you think will be important for us to be able to scale up investments in transport decarbonization. Mike, I'll go to you very, very quickly, 30 seconds.
I think the most important element that I want to bring to this is that there's a very large existing fleet of vehicles out there. And in order for us to meet the Paris Agreement goals, we need to address that as well. And that's why we're very interested in trying to find ways to develop low carbon fuels that are backwards compatible with that enormous fleet of vehicles that are going to be out there and they're going to continue to exist for quite some time.
Ahmed, let me come back to you. Your one thing that you think that we should do if we're going to be able to scale up investments in this sector?
I think we need more working together. I cannot emphasize enough need for collaboration between financiers, private sector, and research. This is the time for everyone to be working together, and this is the way to upscale this action on low carbon development. And
Tracy, what do you have? What's your one thing that you think is really critical that's on your mind?
I think we're at a unique moment, hopefully coming out of the pandemic, but with the stimulus money going towards trying to get economies going again, and let's use it to recover better. Let's think about ways to create jobs and economic stimulus and provide what's needed to get us towards the Paris Agreement and our decarbonization goals.
Terrific. Well, I want to thank all of you for first of all, taking the time to be on this panel and really sharing these really excellent practical insights based on your work with us today. And so I was speaking to Tracy Crow, who's the Chief of Staff at Sustainable Energy for All, C4All, Ahmed Al-Kabani, and Ahmed, I know I've butchered your name several times, my apologies. He is the manager for climate change at the Climate Change Division Resilience and Social Development Department at the Islamic Development Bank, and Michael Travel of Aramco, which is an energy and chemical company. Thank you very much, all three of you, and enjoy the rest of your day. So we are now going to take another quick break before we come back to our second panel. And the second panel builds on what we've heard today about the context that we're in and starts to look at some of the things that are working in countries, in cities, experiences from practitioners around key policies, investments that have worked, there's the size of investments and other actions, as well as what they think are critical factors for progress. We'll do that after this video, which is courtesy of TED Countdown, Why Act Now? So welcome back. We're now into the second panel, and we want to try now to get into some of the nitty-gritty details of specific policies and barriers that have been overcome in certain circumstances by countries and cities. Because one of the things that we want to try and do in this work that we're doing in the lead up to COP26 next year is to try and get a sense of some of the policies, actions that are working, that are worth replicating, and have a repository that we can look at in the next 12 months as we collect these ideas from across the world. So this session starts that process where we get a sense of what's actually happening on the ground and what are some of the things that have actually worked. On the panel, I'm joined by John Graham, who's a principal industry specialist at the International Finance Corporation, IFC. John leads sector issues related to transport, as well as the origination, analysis, negotiation, and execution of project and structured finance transactions in the infrastructure space globally. Also joined by Ariel Alvarez, who's a project manager for the GEF and UNDP's MOVES project in Uruguay, which is being implemented in the energy and environmental ministries to promote more efficient and sustainable mobility. Also joining the panel is Raul Alfaro Pelico, who is the sustainability manager at Acciona, a utility company, where he works on environmental, social, and governance matters at the global level. And last but not least is Ms. Suzanne Green, who's at the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics, and she's an expert advisor for the Smart Freight Center. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. So I guess the first question, I mean, we want to get into, what are some of the things that have actually worked? So why don't I start with you, Ariel? can you tell us about some of the things that you've been doing and some of the areas where you've seen progress and why it is that those things have worked?
Okay, thank you very much. Just a slight introduction. You know, in Uruguay, we are facing this policy of sustainable mobility as one of the most important policies in Uruguay, based in the NDC and Paris Agreement. And why it has been done that today in Uruguay? Because we just from 2008 we are implementing a policy of energy efficiency, and based on that we changed the production matrix of electricity. And today in Uruguay we can say that 98% of electricity last year and every year from now is produced in local renewable energy. So today, if we want to continue the decarbonization of the economy, we need to go to transportation. This is why we are doing this today in Uruguay. Based on that, we are implementing, and I'm the manager of the MOVES project. This project is a UNDP project from GF funds, and it is being implemented in the energy and environment ministries. So what are we doing? We basically we're trying to make all mobility to go to sustainable mobilities. We tackle on freight the modes to go to electric modes, and we obviously work on mobility, people mobility, trying to go to sustainable mobility, based always in the person, and that's why we work in active mobility, and we work obviously in transportation, public transportation, buses, no? And this is the objective.
Fantastic. Do you want to give us just a sense of what are some of the key policies that you've adopted that seem to be helping progress your objectives?
Very good. Based on that, what we are trying to do in Uruguay is to make changes that are going to produce very big impacts in the future. Based on that is what we talk about technological tests. Okay, so for instance, in freight, what we are doing, we have some agreements, and we are letting for free some these little trucks, electric trucks, so companies can try them. They use them during 1 month for free, and they say they see this is nice, all the benefits of this type, and they actually with this test they say, okay, I can work with them, and we expect on that they buy it. For sustainable mobility, as I said, basically in people, we are trying to have different actions, cultural change, and trying to go further on the conditions for them working in the housing ministry. Also, we are producing guides to develop sustainable mobility in Uruguay, in the cities, and we are also working on the quality indicators on public transportation, and based on in that we are trying to introduce all the operational indicators, but also the indicators based on gender, and also how people need to act, let's say like that, and to live when they are in the buses. Okay. And I left to the last point, but it's more one of the things that is more visible today in Uruguay. We are working a lot in a policy that was implemented by the government, is to buy electric buses by the operators. it was created by 4 ministries actually: economics ministry, environment ministry, energy ministry, and also transportation, a subsidy that today exists in Uruguay that allows the operators to buy one electric bus at the price that they bought before a diesel bus. So this is creating big changes in Uruguay. This was implemented here, and we call this also a technical test, because we want them to see these buses and to adopt them and to see all the benefits that they can have.
So let me bring Raul in at this point. So we've heard a little bit about what's happening in Uruguay and some of the investments that they're making into sort of decarbonized transport. Can you tell me a little bit from your experience and what you're seeing? What are some of the policy and investment decisions that municipalities and cities need to be taking? What are some of the things that are working?
Well, thank you, first of all, very much for the opportunity to be part of this very distinguished panel, and especially for being preceded by very distinguished speakers. I'd like to refer to Madame Ote's presentation, which I think really well set the framework. From a policy perspective, it's awkward for the private sector to be talking about it because we basically deliver solutions. But I think it's important to highlight where we are right now. We are in the almost in the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, and we are seeing very little progress in terms of the updates of the commitments, as it was shown in one of the videos. So for us, 5 years ago, I would say 4 years ago, when the Paris Agreement was finally ratified in 2016, it was critical, first of all, to make a commitment. And so Acciona decided to be carbon neutral and has been carbon neutral since 2016. We have also set science-based targets, whereby we will be reducing our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 60% by 2030, and our Scope 3 emissions by 47% by 2030, compared to our Paris Agreement date levels. Now, why is that important for us? Is because you mentioned earlier that we are an electric utility, and indeed we are the greenest electric utility for the 6th year running. However, Acciona provides also infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure solutions, such as transportation, water. And why I'm saying all of that? Because for us, the guiding principle and the guiding vision is the SDGs. We don't see ourselves as a company that delivers on energy. We see ourselves as a company, first, of a new sector, the sector of the SDGs. What guides that? It's first of all the Vision 2030. What guides that? Also the Paris Agreement commitments. But in the context of where we are based in Spain, and in Europe, clearly the European Green Deal for us is a game changer. That is the supportive environment that Madame Ote referred to. From a policy perspective, the European Green Deal, and most specifically the European Union taxonomy for sustainable economic activities, is critical. You've mentioned, and it has been discussed earlier, about the attraction of private investment towards green investments, or private finance to green investments. One of the key challenges that we're seeing right now, especially now that there is so much appetite for green investments, is that there's a lot of greenwashing. It hasn't been touched on in the panel today, but now everything looks green, everything is sustainable, everything is green. The European Union taxonomy helps investors really distinguish activities that substantially contribute to, in this case, the European Green Deal. So for us, that is the guiding policy.
Excellent. And we'll come back both to you and to Ariel, because I want to dig a little bit into some of the micro issues around pricing, in addition to some of the macro issues that you've laid on the table for us, Raul. But let me go to John. John, same question to you. What are some of the things that you're seeing from the IFC that are actually having an impact? So we heard about the huge financing gap, opportunities to be innovative. Can you give us, from what you're doing, from your work, some of the things that you think have shown a lot of promise, have delivered significantly?
Sure. Thank you. And I, again, thanks for the invitation today. And it's very humbling to be with such a great panel and great colleagues on the line. Yeah, listen, I'm in the global transport group at the IFC, and so I only cover transport, but I cover it everywhere. But I very much make reference to what Ariel just mentioned in Uruguay about working across 4 different ministries, because you can't really be a transport person anymore without also being an energy person, without being a city person, without being a capital markets person. I'm a project finance banker by background, and I actually teach project finance at Georgetown. And I think that what's working is the shift. I think that the mental shift, I think, and everybody's focused on this. So whereas before it was kind of something in the past, I mean, we started with ESG and other things years ago, and it was kind of something the multilaterals kind of imposed on companies, and they would kind of roll their eyes, and we would embed those things in our loan agreements. Now there's a complete cultural shift, and I would say the MDBs and again at IFC, for example, we're being pushed by our clients actually to do more on this and to follow them into things that we might not ordinarily do. And so, for example, and we work with Acciona quite directly. Like companies are approaching us for SDG bonds because they want to see that. They want to show that they're doing the right things, but also they want to do the right things. And it's not just a matter of optics. And so, you know, what's happened with our portfolio or I guess our pipeline is that we used to work on projects, and I'm a project finance person, so I've had to adapt as well. And really, people are stepping back and trying to take a more holistic approach to the market and not just looking at individual projects. I mean, Dr. Ota mentioned the 4G in Colombia as an opportunity. I mean, it was looked at as a whole program and not just a single project. And I also do a lot in mass transit. And in the mass transit sector, if you only look at the project that you're focused on, you really run the risk of having a stranded asset in 5 to 10 years, because everything else, there's a whole ecosystem around these projects that needs to be taken into account. And if you don't look at those things, it's not just bad for the ecosystem or bad for the environment that you're operating in. It's really bad. It's poor risk management. So I think one of the biggest shifts has been the mentality around, it's not just doing good. It's just good risk management and good financial sense to be doing these things as part of the project. So the whole dialogue around this has shifted, and it's been a great pleasure to watch this. I've been doing project finance for 20 years, and the transformation, I would say, in the last couple of years has been nothing short of remarkable. Specific things that have worked. I mean, I'm in the infrastructure team. I'm in the global infrastructure department. So I tend to focus more on transit and less on, say, vehicles and other things, which really get handled by our manufacturing teams, although we're talking to them all the time as well. And I think what we've seen before and after the pandemic has kind of started is that there's a real openness for new business models. And I think for example, in the bus sector, everyone, like globally, and again, being in global is a bit of a blessing and a curse, because you get to see everything, but then you have to try to know everything, which is impossible. But everywhere, cities realize that they have to get soot producing buses off the streets, for example. And everybody knows that. And so what we've seen working now is cities are actually, again, going back to what Ariel mentioned about coordination, and Tracy mentioned this before about partnerships and being multi-sectoral in approach. What works is when the different entities get together, not only the private and public sector, but on the public sector side, the energy team with the transport team, with the gender team, with the sustainability team. And when you get that multi-sectoral approach, you can really come up with pretty amazing opportunities, not only from a development perspective, which we're very focused on, but you can also get the risk and return that you need. And I think what we need to see more of, again, because you've got this massive need, and now you have a need for job creation on top of this with the pandemic, and a need for a rebound. You've got to figure out a way to marry this mountain of global capital that's available, and central banks have their feet to the floor. How to marry that capital with projects that make sense from a risk and return perspective. And I think that's where the focus has shifted. And it's not just like doing good and doing the right things. Again, it's about making smart business decisions and making all of this work from an economic perspective. And I think that's been the biggest shift in the last couple of years. And I think that will only be more pronounced as the pandemic sets in and profitability for everybody becomes really with a laser focus.
And I just wanted to get an example. So you talked about this sort of multi-sectoral approach. Can you give an example specifically of somewhere where you've worked, where you've actually seen this come together and actually work?
Sure. Best example, I started with electric buses. The electric bus companies now, the bus companies, the operators in a lot of countries now are kind of traditional operators that have been working for years and have their own bus routes and have their own fleets. A lot of these are small and kind of informal operators as well. Well, now some of the big players getting into the business are actually utilities, entities like NLX, Engie, for example. They're starting to kind of cross over into the transportation sector. And so what that's created is, and their interactions with the governments, as well as our interaction with the government on the advisory side, has really made everybody kind of look at it as a transport issue, but an energy issue, a real estate issue. And places like Santiago or Bogota, for example, which are putting forth programs for electric buses, they're now putting hundreds, not tens or dozens of buses. They're getting hundreds of electric buses onto the streets with new business models that bring in the different sectors and the different ministries and the different agencies to kind of work together on these programs. And so China is way ahead of everybody on electric buses because they've had the resources and the industrial policy and the subsidies to throw at the problem. But now we're starting to see that the technology has leapt forward and it's getting cheaper, kind of like solar and wind did 10 years ago. And now we're starting to see private sector solutions that might be a bit more feasible for countries that don't have, billions and trillions to throw at the sector. So John, go ahead, please.
Sorry. So John, we'll come back to those examples. And I do want to explore also, you made a very interesting point about learning from failures as well. So I want to come back to some of what you learned from things that didn't work. But let me bring Suzanne in.
Sure.
In the freight sector. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing. What are some of the things that have worked? What are you seeing in this current context and thinking about?
Great, thank you so much. And I'm learning so much in this panel and in this session. So thanks to all the speakers for everything you've shared. So I thought I could highlight a bit from the freight transportation world, what I think is working. And then I also wanted to highlight one thing that I think works in other sectors, but could work better for transport. So first, I'll talk about carbon accounting. So how are emissions communicated along the supply chain? And this is actually quite an important thing in terms of knowing what you're buying. So if you're procuring transportation or maybe you're a carrier, we need to know the emissions of the vehicle and the transportation that we're purchasing. And so for that to work, we need the data to flow between the carriers, the logistics service providers, and the shipper. And we saw that actually wasn't happening very effectively within the transportation sector because of disconnections along the supply chain and a proliferation of different methods in different regions, or methods specific to trucks, trains, ships, or to one country over another, that made it difficult to actually add up the emissions along a supply chain. And so what the Smart Freight Center did very effectively was bring together a group of companies in the Global Logistics Emissions Council to come up with a single framework to unify carbon accounting for all of transportation. And that initiative has been very effective because it worked with all the stakeholders from the very beginning to see, how do you account for transportation? What is useful information? How can you report and communicate this data? And just that exercise alone of developing a rather technical and dry methodology document, which no one really wants to read, but the exercise itself has been very effective in just bringing the issue of transportation emissions to light and putting numbers on it and putting actionable KPIs and metrics that you can start to build towards, right? So, the business world runs on KPIs. So if we don't have numbers, if we don't have metrics behind that for CO2, it's going to be very difficult to track our targets. And I think it gets more interesting now, where we see some more differentiation in the marketplace, where we might see lower carbon options out there, that we aren't just, everything fossil fuels, but maybe there are electric vehicles, maybe there are biofuels available that can lower the emissions. So being able to procure that, to know you're buying that, and to have trustworthy numbers, that's a really important element to just spurring progress, I think. And my second point on what works in other sectors that could work better for transportation is carbon offsetting. So we heard a lot about investments and the potential for investment. But I think there's more potential for investment in the transportation sector from the users themselves. So that could be even us as consumers, but also large companies that are procuring transportation. And right now, companies spend a lot of money on carbon offsets, but very little of that funding is directed towards the transportation sector. So only 0.2% of carbon offset funds go towards transportation. And actually, we see that as a huge potential to grow. There's so much that could be done. We talked about the many different activities that could be done, like decommissioning old vehicles or transitioning to sustainable fuels. So we're working on that quite a bit now. And how can we grow that marketplace? What's missing to be able to have carbon offsets for freight transportation? And I think there's a huge interest there, and that's something we can unlock to accelerate progress, I believe.
Excellent. Ariel, let me come back to you and your experiences in Uruguay. So you'd mentioned earlier on that the country's been working on this since 2008, and you also talked about the 4 ministries that are involved in the current effort. You also mentioned a little bit, but we didn't dig into it, how you're working with fleet owners and sort of thinking about how they make the investments into sort of greener transport. Tell me a little bit about how you got the 4 ministries to work together. I mean, that can't have been easy. Who took the lead? What's the one lesson that you learned from that working together of 4 ministries that you think is essential? And then could you also then talk about how you're able to get owners to make the upfront cost investment into new fleets, knowing that subsidies come later? How has that actually worked?
Very good, thank you. Yes, I think it's very important I will repeat that. You just mentioned it. This is a policy that was approved by all the parliament in 2008, and that put in the road of Uruguay to try to make these changes very fast and in a good way, based on efficiency in energy. This produced changes very fast. In Uruguay, what it was done is to put an ecosystem, an environment good to private investments, and that's how in Uruguay the electric matrix was changed dramatically, and today, as I said, is based basically in renewable energy. This experience, and let me just say a little story about that. When we were facing this some years before, you always have people coming from other countries, consultants and all that, saying, no, pay attention. You will. It's good for you to start with 20%, 30%. After that, it will be impossible. It would all be a big mess. And we continue 20, 30, 40, 50. And today, 98% of the electricity is produced by renewable. So today, Uruguay can tell anyone that we know how to handle that. Mm-hmm. And based on that, we can today say in Uruguay, because economics just were mentioned before. Yes, economics are important. We need to see in sustainability the opportunity there. Today in Uruguay, we stop burning oil to produce electricity, and we know that the economics of the electricity that is being used in Uruguay is based on local cost, because this electricity is produced in Uruguay. Okay, so this is huge. And today we know that in Uruguay, we are exporting energy. Before we didn't have enough. And we know that this electricity produced in Uruguay is the motor of the change in transportation, because it's electricity produced here, and that today we can use to switch again oil that we need to import it and send our dollars to bring this oil and all what it is in the global change of petrol, to change it, to switch it to electricity, local electricity based in renewable. So when we need to make these policies, as it was said, we need to put these ministries, we need to put people that are working in social matters, in gender matters. We need to put the person first. After that, we can call it sustainability, efficiency, green, orange, or blue energy, or circular energy. You call it as you want, but it needs to be to see that we need to put again the person in first. We see differences because we are not all the same type of person. We need to look that and we need to create this environment to have this public, but also foreigner and private investment. In Uruguay, what it was done, and again was approved by all the parliament last year, is to create this subsidy, as I mentioned, that is paying the difference between an electric and a diesel bus. Okay, but again, the one that is buying the electric bus is always the operator, and we are just saying, okay, up to today you have this economy, we will pay you this difference. But what it was proven to the economic ministry of Uruguay is that this was not increasing the money that we are sending to the sector. It was just, look, you are paying some money so this sector can burn oil every day. Today we will stop that because we will take one diesel bus and we will put an electric bus. And if you give us this money, it will not be more money that you are sending to the sector. I explain it again. The money that the country gives to a diesel bus during the whole life of a diesel bus is even more than what we are giving today to this company to buy an electric bus. And on top of that, sorry, just to end, it's not that they just change one bus to the other one. In the technical commission that we proceed, we say, okay, you will change one diesel bus to an electric bus, but on top of that, it will be a better bus. We want that this bus is accessible to anyone, so low floor. We want that this bus have air conditioning that not everyone here has, so people can go in the bus more comfortable. And on top of that, we will put some security cameras, so to be very, very, very calm there. So we are also increasing quality in that. So again, it's not just a technological aspect or based on technological aspects. We want also to increase quality on the services of this that we understand is one of the most sustainable mobility that we need to go further on.
Thank you. I think I just wanted to be clear though, Ariel, that argument and that conversation was enough to overcome concerns by the operators, the owners, to actually put up the upfront cost of buying the new fleet. I think that's the point I wanted to get you, because I think that might be the point of tension.
Okay, very good. I always talk, because as I talk a lot with the ministries, I always talk for public sector. When we go to private sector, what we said, it was that, look, we will switch this money that we will give you every month to burn it on oil, and we will give you in one time. Actually, it's in 7 years, but it doesn't matter because they always finance the buses they buy. We will give you just to have the difference of the cost in one and the other one. And what you will prove based on this experience is that the operation of an electric bus is less than the operation of a diesel bus. That this maybe for us, for technical people, is obvious, but they need is their life also. This is what they are working on. They are bus managers. So and the experience that is been proven today is that one. So I would like just to talk about one company that is not from Montevideo, from the capital, is outside Montevideo. They buy one. After that, they bought two, and now they are going for two other ones. They are multiplying for 5 for the first investment they done. And this is what we are expecting from the other companies. In Uruguay, maybe the changes started very low because we are not imposing big changes on the way these companies work, but we want these changes to be multiplied very fastly. And that's why we're expecting that next year we will have bigger and bigger changes, because based on that, in their own experience, and they are looking that the economics of an electric bus is really lower than a diesel bus. And on top of that, we are increasing the quality of the buses that they have, and we expect obviously that they will increase the users of the buses, because remember, and I finished, there are two things that we want. We also want that people that today are moving in private modes, cars and all that, they switch also to this. And so the operator, for sure, it must be happy. We are asking them and giving the conditions to have better buses, and also expecting that they increase the users. So.
Terrific. Now, I've been given the signal that we're out of time, but I don't want to end without at least underlining from each of you, one thing that you think is a critical factor for success in your work. One of the things that really worked well, that you want to say, this is the one thing that worked well that I think is worth replicating. And John, I haven't forgotten that I was going to come back to you and ask you what it is that you learned in terms of, because you mentioned, and I thought that was quite interesting. We hadn't talked about the issue of learning from things that didn't work. So you're going to have to give me that, but it has to be within 30 seconds or less. So let's start with you, Suzanne. What is the one thing that you think is a critical factor for success and that's worth replicating?
I think in the freight industry, it's connecting between the shippers, logistics service providers, and carriers. So there's, it's a complicated ecosystem and there's many different players involved. So finding ways to bridge that gap and speak across those supply chains is really the key. And I think we were talking about funding and investments, who should pay for these sustainable investments in that tier? How do we bring money down to the carriers, the ones that are actually, needing to invest in the equipment? And I think these connections are what's going to make it happen. Thanks.
Fantastic. Ra, let's go to you very quickly. What is something that you want to leave as a thought that is worth replicating? And actually, if you have a lesson that you learned from something that didn't work, that would be great too.
Thank you. I think, first of all, is having a really clear sustainable development lens. I think John alluded to the fact that it's a transport project. It's hardly a transport project, it's a development project. I have an example in Ecuador that I wanted to bring out some examples of that. The metro line that Dr. Ote alluded to, it leads to $50 million worth of savings, of fuel savings a year. It connects the poor parts of Quito to the opportunity to jobs. It actually reduces gender-based violence. It's not just the 67,000 tons of CO2 that is reducing. It's not just the 40% reduction of commuting time for the poorest segments of the population. It is also these development benefits, sustainable development benefits from a social perspective. So I think when you look at investments in mobility, you should look at also how mobility contributes to the broader development, because when you look at projects from that lens, then you're not just looking at CO2, you're not just looking at the economics, you're also looking at development.
Okay, and last but not least, John, what are some of the things that you want to leave with us in terms of what works, and just very quickly?
With 30 seconds, I don't want to go off on some nerdy tangent about the bus structures. Look, just mentioning, kind of reiterating what Raul said about how to look at mobility with kind of the broader sustainability lens. I think what we need to do, and I think the development banks do, and the private sector needs to do, the governments need more help. They need more advisory. They need more connection. They need to get feedback, because when you get the structures right, and Ariel mentioned also getting the policies and imposing the changes on the private sector, it doesn't have to be an imposition. It could be a nudge. But when you get the structures right, and when you can align the public sector with private sector interests, and at the end of the day, it's focused on just a better sustainable outcome, including focus on the person, as we were mentioning before, putting the person first. I think that's it. And I think as IFC, we need to invest, and we need to mobilize investment, all those great things about the billions and trillions people talk about, but we need to be part of producing more projects that are bankable and investable. And I think that's where we're trying to create more focus every week.
Perfect. Well, I really want to thank all of you very, very sincerely for taking the time, but also sharing very practical insights around what has worked and what the critical factors for success are. I think this is going to be a really excellent starting point as we collect these nuggets as we build up in the path to COP26 in the next 12 months. So thank you very much, John, Ariel, Raul, and Suzanne for joining us. Really appreciated having you on the panel. So we're nearing the end of this particular session, but before we do that, I want to hand over to Nancy Van Dyke, who's the head of Sustainable Mobility for All, and she's going to give us a view and tie everything that we've heard today together and give us a sense of what this all means, why it matters, and as we start to look at sort of next steps and where we're going to next. So let me hand over to you, Nancy.
Thank you, Toko. What a rich discussion we had here today. And I want to thank all the panelists for really contributing to these very exciting discussions we had today. What I take from this is a number of agreements we have. One is that it's very clear that we all want to decarbonize transport, and we all agree that it is long overdue. It was very energizing to hear about the experience of Ethiopia, Uruguay, where things have been happening. And yet, when you look at carbon emissions for transport, it is a fact that we have not made the progress that we were imagining when most countries signed off the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. So the question is, why is it that we don't have the scale at this point? And I will not attempt to summarize what we heard today. I couldn't do justice actually to all the contributions from speakers. But what I would like to do here is to extract from their interventions a few points that will enable us to really address two questions. One is the overarching question of this session, which was what prevents the scale up? And I will summarize this in about 6 points, and then close my intervention by some recommendations and some points I have heard about what could happen between now and COP26 to make sure that at Transport Day, we don't come up again with commitments and ambitions, but we come with showcasing real progress on decarbonization of transport. So the first question of what prevents the scale up and what is needed to really get the scale that we have to have on transport, I have taken 6 points from these interventions. One is we clearly need vision, leadership, and political will. And I think that came out very clearly from the intervention from the Minister of Ethiopia, who said, even though we don't contribute, and we're a very small contributor to global CO2 emission, we still view decarbonization as a key component to safeguard the environment for future generation, and as an important consideration in order to reduce air pollution. And she provided very good examples on how Ethiopia has gone about addressing this issue up and front. We also heard from Mr. Alvarez about the experience in Uruguay, where he said, we first tackle the problem on the energy side and in the electricity side and made sure that energy would be produced locally. And then now we are in a situation where we can finally address the problem of mobility. So really vision, leadership, and political will are critical. So that's the first element. The second element is this whole idea that we really need to start beyond, to think beyond projects, but really think system-wide. Michael shared with us the importance of thinking about electrification in a much broader sense. Electrical vehicles do make sense for individual cars, but they do not make sense for aviation, for shipping, and for the trucking industry. And yet, those modes of transportation are very important. And he clearly told us that we cannot think silo, but we need to think about all modes of transportation and about all possible energy solutions if we really want to decarbonize the sector. And of course, this has huge financial implication because frankly, each of these individual technological solutions do require massive investments. And so the question is it viable? So system thinking is very important. And John also mentioned the importance of thinking holistically about markets. We no longer can think about individual projects, but we need to think about the whole market. He shared with us how the electrical bus market had changed. We used to have very traditional operators working in this market. We now see big utilities companies coming into this market. So clearly the transport energy nexus is becoming increasingly important to look at. The third element also that came out from every single intervention was the importance of coordination among actors and the fact that we need to think out of silos. We talk about the importance of partnering in the industry, the importance of bringing the finance industry into the thinking. We talk about coordinations among MDBs. We heard about the importance of coordination between non-civil organizations, Sustainable Mobility for, Sustainable Energy for, talking with MDBs. We talk about working across ministries. So clearly coordination is very important. And of course, it makes solutions much more difficult to design, but this is clearly the way out. Fourth element is the finance part. Ms. Hote told us about the huge financing needs in transport. She talked about 50 trillion needed in the transport side, but she also mentioned the importance of huge economic opportunities that are created, and she gave us the example of Tesla. She also told us that there is a strong appetite from investors for the transport sector. But she said, we need to do more of what we are already doing, and we need to do it at several levels. We need to do it at the level of government resources. We need to engage the MDBs. We need to talk about syndication and work together among MDBs. We need the private sector to be involved. There is clearly a need to do more on the PPP side. And she also talked about the importance of now bringing national and regional development banks into the solution mix and the finance mix. Then on the innovation and financial innovation, she told about green bonds, about several mechanisms being used by other sectors like Gavi and Guaranco that offers now probably new prospect for mobilizing financing for the transport sector at scale. And she encouraged the transport sector to look at those mechanisms and see to what extent they could not be developed for actually bringing very much the financing that we need in the transport sector. Fifth, we need to look at the suite of policy instruments. We heard about green investment taxonomy, the importance of subsidy schemes that probably will not be sustainable over the long term and cannot be replicated for other modes of transportation. So we need to be creative on that front. We also heard about carbon offsetting schemes that are not yet well used by the transport sector, So clearly there is a range of policy instruments that we need to look at again to actually bring the decarbonization that we want. And then finally, but I think very importantly, Michael told us about the importance of making business sense. And he reminded us that at the end of the day, private companies do have to meet their bottom line. And the COVID situation and the global recession has made this requirement more important than ever. Many of those private companies, including utility companies, have been hit, and transport operators have been hit bad during the COVID crisis. So their bottom line was affected. And so now they have indeed to look at low carbon solutions, but it has to make business sense to them. Now, to the second question, what needs to happen between now and COP26? I would put 3 points that I heard. One is that the conversation in the various panels has showed us that we are very far away from what we heard in Paris in 2015, that it would be very easy to decarbonize the sector and that policies are all out there to be implemented by government. Clearly, this conversation showed us that we have achieved a very high level of technicality and complexity, and also interdependency that we need to look at when we think about advising government on what to do. And so I see very much out of this discussion a need to probably organize and structure better the knowledge that we have from the various actors, including country decision makers, on policies that have worked and good practice example. So for me, it is very clear that there is a need to work on two fronts. Develop a policy framework that can resonate with a lot of actors and that can even resonate globally is the way forward. On the policy framework side, we have done quite a bit of work over the past 3 years, I would say, in terms of bringing the knowledge on policies and recommendations that can help countries to make progress on decarbonizing the sector. But more is needed. I can talk about what we did under Some for All initiative, where we worked for 2 years to actually establish a catalog of policy measures, more than 190, that we gather from the knowledge that we have globally on policies that can help achieve sustainable mobility. But I also know of other actors like the International Transport Forum that have been doing similar exercise and have looked at what is needed, what are the policies needed for specifically decarbonizing the transport sector. And we know that SLOCAT has been also doing. So a lot of actors have been working in that space. It is time to bring this knowledge together and offer to decision makers a coherent policy framework. But that will not be enough. I think we need to think globally. So that policy framework has to be global. The issue that we face are global, and so the response has to be global as well. It will not be enough that one country or another, or one project or another is implemented. We really need to tackle this problem in a very global way. And so I think that on that front, there is still a lot of work that needs to take place. Now, but is that enough? A lot of the recommendations that we have pulled together are very high level. And what we heard from the second panel is that there is a need to unpack those policy recommendations and get to a level of granularity that enables every single policymaker to go to that policy recommendation and say, I know what to do, what exactly to do. So that work has still to take place. And so from my point of view, I see very much a need to do this between now and COP26. And we can think about different formats, but one format that I think would be very conducive to to a progress on that front would be to organize a series of deep dives or technical discussions around this catalog of policy measures that we have elaborated, and really come to a level of granularity that is very helpful for decision makers. So this could be done between now and COP26. A second important component would be to actually help countries to get transport at the core of their climate change discussion and decarbonization effort. It is still very much the case that many of the NDCs do not include transport as a critical sector to decarbonize and to achieve the 1.5 emission, 1.5 degrees of the Paris Climate Agreement. So here I see a need for MDBs to actually strengthen their effort, upstream work with client countries, helping them to really make transport part of the NDC strategies going forward. And then finally, we have seen over the past 5 years a lot of advocacy, a lot of commitments. What we really need at this point are big demonstration projects. We need to see where it has worked. And of course, we have each of us has examples that we can show. But what we need at this point are big projects, big demonstration projects at the level of a city or even at the level of a country, so that we can actually demonstrate that all those policies, when they are adopted, can actually lead to significant dent on CO2 emissions. So in conclusion, I would say that there is still a lot of work ahead of us. And we want to make sure that COP26 is not one of those events, one of these additional COPs filled with a lot of promises, a lot of commitments, but that we come to COP with real outcome, real progress. And I would close my statement by what I heard Mr. Ote say. There is a huge economic opportunity ahead of us and ahead of transport. It is now up to us to seize it.
Thank you very much, Nancy Van Dijk. She's the head of Sustainable Mobility for All. That was a very comprehensive and very helpful wrap up of what we heard today, and a good call to action for what we need to do in the months coming up towards COP26 next year. I think all that's left for me now is to say thank you very much to our speakers today. We had 3 speakers, the Vice President of Infrastructure from the World Bank. We also heard from her, the Honorable Minister of Transport from Ethiopia. We also heard from Aruma Ote, who's at the University of Oxford. Thank you very much to all the panelists. We had 2 panels today, really fantastic conversations, excellent insights and ideas that we can start thinking about. And of course, to all of you that participated, there were some questions in the Q&A. I'm sorry that we didn't get to those, but thank you very much for staying, for contributing your time and interest. And I'd like to say again, a huge thank you to the organizers, Sustainable Mobility for All, Transport Decarbonization Alliance, and the World Resources Institute. My name is Togo Moyo. It really was an immense pleasure to host this very important session. Thank you.